They said my deck lighting threatened deer migration, a theory delivered with the unearned confidence of a man whose primary interaction with nature was likely swatting a fly during a Zoom call. Chad Bronson, HOA president, puffed out his chest, the embroidered logo on his polo straining against the battlefield of his midsection. He had the kind of face that seemed perpetually on the verge of complaining to a manager. Behind him, two goons, let's call them Huey and Dewey, clutched chainsaws, their expressions a blend of thuggish obedience and mild confusion. This was new. Usually, it was just passive-aggressive notes about the precise Pantone shade of my cabin's trim or the unacceptable rusticity of my woodpile. My cabin, tucked away on a 10-acre plot abutting national forest, a place my grandfather built with his own hands, a sanctuary where the only rules were respect for the land and the occasional, unspoken agreement with the bears about who got the berry patch. It was, technically, within the sprawling, nonsensical jurisdiction of the Mountains Whisper Estates Homeowners Association, a cancerous entity I'd inherited along with the property deed. I'd always treated their missives with the detached amusement one reserves for flat-earther manifestos. Until the chainsaws. This is an official HOA enforcement action, Chad declared, waving a laminated card that probably came free with a label maker. Your non-compliant illumination constitutes an immediate ecological hazard. We issued warnings. Warnings. Yes, I'd received the emails, meticulously filed under circular file fodder. They'd cited Bylaw 7, subsection D, paragraph 2. Exterior lighting must not cause undue disturbance to indigenous fauna or established migratory pathways. My lighting consisted of two low-wattage, downward-facing amber LEDs by the deck stairs, specifically chosen for minimal wildlife impact, a fact I, as a senior wildlife officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was perhaps uniquely qualified to determine. I'd even sent them the manufacturer's specs and a peer-reviewed study on avian-safe lighting. Their response was a notice of impending fine. I'd paid it, just to make them go away. Apparently, that was insufficient. Chad, I began, keeping my voice level, a trick learned in countless tense standoffs, with poachers less predictable and considerably more dangerous than this suburban warlord. You're on private property. And those chainsaws are a profoundly stupid idea. Huey revved his. A cloud of blue smoke, smelling of cheap oil and hubris, drifted towards the ancient pines. The bylaws grant us access for remediation of violations, Chad countered, smug. This deck, this lighting, it's a blight, an eyesore, and a threat. He gestured vaguely towards the vast, indifferent forest. The deer, you see. I saw, all right. I saw a petty tyrant drunk on a thimbleful of power, flanked by morons with power tools. I saw the glint of something ugly in his eyes, a personal vendetta I hadn't bothered to dignify with investigation. My family, my daughter, loved this deck. We'd sat here counting stars, listening to the owls, feeling the deep peace of the wilderness seep into our bones. They weren't just threatening wood and wire, they were desecrating a memory, a sanctuary. The emotional calculus was simple. They had crossed a line etched not in HOA bylaws, but in something far more fundamental. My calm, the professional veneer I wore like body armor, began to crack, revealing the cold, hard certainty beneath. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I could do. They were about to find out. Turn those off, I said, the words flat, devoid of warmth. And leave. Now, Chad smirked. Or what? You'll file a complaint? Huey took a step towards the deck stairs. That's when the first internal alarm bell, the one usually reserved for armed encounters in remote wilderness, began its insistent, chilling peal. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was an invasion, and I was about to go from reluctant homeowner to a different kind of officer entirely. The whine of the chainsaw bit into the morning air, a screech of violation that echoed through the silent trees. It was, I would later reflect, with a detachment that surprised even me, the precise moment Chad Bronson signed his own warrant. The sound of splintering wood was a physical blow. I watched, a cold fury coiling in my gut, as Huey, with brutish efficiency, began to dismantle the railing my grandfather had hand-planed. Dewey, not to be outdone, started on a support post. Chad stood with his arms crossed, a Roman emperor presiding over the sacking of a particularly inconvenient village. The destruction was swift, brutal, and utterly gratuitous. They weren't just removing the lights, they were demolishing the structure. The badges they'd flashed earlier, I now saw with chilling clarity, were probably just their HOA ID cards, presented with enough bluster to cow the average homeowner. They were operating under the color of an authority they grotesquely inflated. The moral violation was absolute. This wasn't about deer, or lights, or bylaws. This was about power, about the ugly, festering need of a small man to dominate, to destroy what he couldn't control or understand. My cabin, my legacy, was being desecrated by fools. I didn't intervene physically. That would have been messy, unpredictable, and played into their narrative of the unreasonable recluse. My mind, however, was already a whirlwind of tactical retaliation. The dormant authority, the federal clearance, the network of contacts, the years of navigating complex legal and jurisdictional landscapes, it all came flooding to the fore. While they were reducing my deck to kindling, I was already running through checklists, formulating a response that would be as precise and devastating as a surgical strike. The initial shock had burned off, leaving behind a crystalline focus. They had brought chainsaws to a battle of wits and regulations. They were, to put it mildly, outgunned. I let them finish. Let them revel in their petty triumph. Let them document their own criminality. Because I knew something they didn't. 17 trail cameras, strategically placed around my property, not just for wildlife observation but for security, were recording every smug grin, every rev of the engine, every splintering board. High definition, time-stamped, undeniable. One was even equipped with audio. Chad's little speech about ecological hazards would make for compelling listening in the right forum. When the last section of railing crashed to the ground, Chad dusted off his hands. "There," he announced, as if he'd personally averted a natural disaster. "Compliance achieved. We'll bill you for the removal and, of course, the accrued fines." He actually smiled. It was the smile of a man who had mistaken a sleeping grizzly for a throw rug. I simply nodded, my expression unreadable. "Thank you for your diligence, Mr. Bronson." He looked momentarily surprised by my equanimity, then puffed up again. "Just doing our job. Maintaining community standards." They packed up their tools, leaving behind a scene of senseless destruction, a gaping wound where my deck had been. The sawdust lay thick on the ground, like the cast-off skin of their malice. As their truck rumbled away, kicking up dust on the access road, I walked over to the wreckage. My daughter's small handprint, immortalized in a smear of old paint on a piece of the fallen railing, stared up at me. That's when the cold fury solidified into something harder, colder: resolve. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. They thought this was over. For me, it was just the overture to a very different kind of opera, one where I would be conducting, and the final act would be their public, legal, and utter humiliation. The first call I made wasn't to a contractor. It was to Ranger Dave, my perpetually caffeinated, tech-savvy colleague down at the district office, a man whose enthusiasm for exposing bureaucratic incompetence was matched only by his love for conspiracy theories, some of which, disconcertingly, turned out to be true. "Dave," I said, my voice tight, "I need you to pull every frame from my cabin cams, starting 700 this morning, audio too, and run a deep dive on a one Chadwick Bronson, president of the Mountains Whisper Estates HOA. I want to know his blood type and his preferred brand of dental floss by lunchtime." There was a pause, then Dave's voice, crackling with excitement. "Boss, what happened? Did Bigfoot finally sue you for paparazzi tactics?" "Worse, Dave, much worse." "Oh, say no more," he replied, the glee palpable. "This is going to be beautiful." The footage from the 17 cameras was, as expected, damningly exquisite. Every angle, every idiotic pronouncement, Every act of vandalism was captured with digital precision. Ranger Dave, fueled by righteous indignation and an entire pot of coffee, had it cataloged, cross-referenced, and backed up to a secure server before noon. "Boss, this is gold-plated, diamond-encrusted platinum, insured litigation fuel," he chortled over the comms. "Chadwick Chad, Throckmorton Bronson III, and yes, that's his full glorious name, not only authorized this little rampage, he specifically instructed Huey, real name Herbert Jenkins, and Dewey, one Dwayne Miller, both unemployed landscapers with a penchant for cheap beer and following stupid orders, to make an example of your non-compliant structure." His words, caught on Cam 7, the one hidden in the old birdhouse. Audio's a little windy, but the intent is crystal clear. Dave had also unearthed a fascinating history of the Mountains Whisper HOA, a litany of frivolous lawsuits against bewildered homeowners, selective enforcement of bylaws, and whispers of financial irregularities in the community fund. Chad Bronson, it turned out, ran the HOA like his personal fiefdom, supported by a board of either equally delusional or deeply intimidated sycophants. The badges they flashed? Laminated HOA membership cards with Enforcement Committee printed beneath their names. Not quite federal marshal material. My next call was to Sarah Holloway, Assistant U.S. Attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer I'd worked with on several complex wildlife trafficking cases. Her specialty was untangling jurisdictional knots and bringing the hammer down on those who thought they were above the law. I laid out the facts. The location of my cabin abutting national forest land, the destruction of property, the flimsy pretext, the potential for their actions to have actually disturbed wildlife, cutting down trees, even small ones for access, without permits, noise pollution during nesting season, and their absurd impersonation, however vague, of legitimate authority. "They chainsawed your deck because of deer migration?" Sarah asked, a note of incredulous amusement in her voice. "The irony is richer than their president's cholesterol levels, I imagine. The lighting was too amber, shielded, 5-watt LEDs, Sarah. Less impact than a Firefly convention." I sent her the link to Dave's meticulously organized evidence folder. The silence on her end was punctuated by occasional clicks. Then, a low whistle. "Michael," she said, her voice now stripped of amusement, replaced by the cold precision I knew so well. "This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is criminal destruction of property, potentially felony level given the value if we factor in the historical significance of the structure. Trespassing, definitely. Possible violations of the Lacey Act if their actions inadvertently harmed or harassed protected species, or damaged habitat on or near federal land. And their badges, that's tiptoeing into impersonating an officer territory, even if it's just a local ordinance violation. It shows intent and a pattern," she continued. "The fact that you are a federal wildlife officer, and this cabin is your private property, used for observing and appreciating the very wildlife they claim to protect, the optics are catastrophic for them. We discussed strategy, a multi-pronged approach. Civil action for damages, of course, but Sarah was also interested in the potential for criminal charges, especially against Bronson for orchestrating the event. The local sheriff, John Henderson, was an old-school lawman with little patience for fools or bullies. He'd worked with FWS on poaching cases before. Sarah suggested we loop him in. "He'll appreciate the heads-up," she said, "and he might have his own bone to pick with Bronson's HOA antics if they've been overstepping locally. My federal clearance opened doors, smooth pathways." This wasn't just Michael Peterson, a grieved cabin owner. This was Senior Wildlife Officer Peterson, whose professional expertise and personal space had been violated. The system, often cumbersome, was now aligning to become a weapon. The plan began to form, each step a carefully calibrated move in a larger campaign. Step 1. Formal cease and desist letters, delivered with maximum legal weight. Step 2. Detailed damage assessment, and demand for restitution. Step 3. Criminal complaints filed with Sheriff Henderson's office, supported by our federal findings if applicable. Step 4. A formal complaint to the state agency overseeing HOAs, highlighting the pattern of abuse, and threaded through it all, the constant, unwavering pressure of the evidence. The trail cams hadn't just recorded a crime. They'd recorded the arrogance, the stupidity, the sheer, unadulterated malice of Chad Bronson and his cronies. It was time to introduce them to the concept of consequences, delivered with the full, unblinking force of the law they so clearly disdained. This wasn't revenge. This was ecological and legal rebalancing. They had disturbed the natural order. I was merely restoring it. The cease and desist letters were masterpieces of legalistic dread, drafted by Sarah's office and carrying the implicit weight of federal scrutiny. They weren't just ordering Bronson and his board to refrain from further contact or trespass. They were laying the groundwork for every legal action to follow, referencing specific statutes violated and hinting at the extensive evidence already compiled. Ranger Dave, who insisted on being part of the delivery team, for morale boss and to witness the dawning horror, practically vibrated with anticipation. We decided against a dramatic confrontation at an HOA meeting. Not yet. Phase 1 was about shock and awe, delivered personally and unequivocally. I had Sheriff Henderson accompany me, not in an official capacity for the CD delivery, but as a concerned local law enforcement observer, given the potential for escalation and the reports of property destruction. His presence alone, a uniformed 6'4" pillar of county authority, was worth 1,000 legal threats to a man like Bronson. We found Chad Bronson on his meticulously manicured lawn, supervising a bewildered-looking teenager power washing a driveway that already gleamed with oppressive sterility. He was wearing another polo, this one a nauseating shade of salmon. When he saw me, and then Sheriff Henderson towering beside me, the color drained from his face, leaving the salmon polo looking garishly optimistic. "Mr. Bronson," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, which I've found is far more unnerving to guilty parties than shouting, "I have some documents for you." I handed him the envelope. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. Sheriff Henderson just watched, arms crossed, his expression neutral but radiating a palpable sense of "don't try anything stupid." Bronson fumbled with the flap, pulled out the heavy paper. As he read, his jaw tightened. The smugness, the arrogance I'd seen at my cabin, evaporated like morning mist, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. His eyes darted from the legal jargon to my face, then to Henderson, then back to the paper. I could almost see the internal calculations, the frantic search for an escape route where none existed. This is outrageous," he sputtered, falling back on bluster, but it was a hollow, deflated version. "We were within our rights. The bylaws clearly state." "The bylaws, Mr. Bronson," I interjected, my voice still quiet, "do not supersede state and federal law. Vandalism, criminal trespass, potential environmental violations, these are not covered by your HOA covenant, I assure you." Sheriff Henderson cleared his throat. "Mr. Bronson, I've seen Officer Peterson's preliminary evidence. Those trail camera videos are quite illuminating, especially the audio from Cam 7. Make an example, I believe you said." Bronson paled. The mention of specific camera numbers, specific quotes, landed like body blows. He knew, in that instant, that he was comprehensively, unequivocally screwed. We repeated the process with each board member. Their reactions varied from stunned silence to tearful panic to indignant, quickly quashed sputtering. The common denominator was fear. The carefully constructed illusion of their HOA power, their little kingdom of petty rules, was crumbling before their eyes, exposed as a flimsy facade by the harsh light of actual law. The supporting cast of neighbors, the silent majority who had endured Bronson's reign, began to stir. News of the official-looking deliveries, especially involving the sheriff, spread through Mountain's Whisper estates like wildfire. My phone started pinging with tentative messages of support, then outright expressions of gratitude from other homeowners who had their own tales of Bronson's tyranny. They'd been too afraid, too isolated, to fight back. My actions, it seemed, were a catalyst. The tactical metaphor was holding. We had breached their outer defenses. The next phase would be the full assault, leveraging the evidence to dismantle not just their case, but their entire rotten structure. The damage assessment for the deck was submitted, itemized down to the last stainless steel screw, including costs for removal of the debris they'd left, and a premium for restoration of a structure with historical and sentimental value. It was a significant sum, enough to make the HOA's insurance adjuster weep, but the real pain for them was yet to come. The seeds of public reckoning had been sown. They were about to learn that when you try to silence a whisper of dissent with a chainsaw, you might just awaken a storm. The upcoming HOA monthly meeting, usually a tedious affair presided over by Bronson with the pomp of a minor dictator, was suddenly the hottest ticket in the estates. Whispers had become a roar. My formal request to be added to the agenda, citing discussion of recent HOA enforcement actions and presentation of relevant evidence, had been reluctantly approved by a now terrified board secretary. Bronson, I heard, had tried to cancel the meeting, citing unforeseen scheduling conflicts. But the bylaws, those very same documents he'd weaponized, mandated regular meetings. He was trapped by his own rules. The community hall was packed. Neighbors I'd only ever seen as fleeting figures in passing cars were there, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hungry anticipation. Ranger Dave, looking like a kid on Christmas morning, was setting up a projector and screen, ostensibly for my presentation. He'd also, with a mischievous grin, placed several discreet, high-definition cameras around the room, for posterity, boss, and in case anyone tries to get froggy. Chad Bronson and his remaining board loyalists sat at the front table, looking like prisoners awaiting sentencing. Bronson attempted to open the meeting with his usual bluster, but his voice was thin, his confidence visibly shattered. He fumbled through the minutes of the previous meeting, his eyes darting nervously towards me. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium, not with anger, but with a somber precision. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying easily in the hushed room. "Many of you are aware of an incident that occurred on my property on the morning of October 12th, an incident orchestrated by Mr. Bronson and members of his enforcement committee, resulting in the illegal destruction of my family's cabin deck." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mr. Bronson claimed this action was necessary because my deck lighting posed a threat to deer migration. I paused, letting the absurdity of it hang in the air. As a senior wildlife officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with over 20 years of experience in wildlife management and conservation, I can assure you that two 5-watt downward-shielded amber LEDs do not disrupt deer migration. What does disrupt wildlife, however, is the unauthorized operation of chainsaws in a sensitive habitat, the destruction of vegetation, and the general thuggery exhibited by individuals acting far outside their legal authority. I gestured to the screen. "But you don't have to take my word for it." Dave dimmed the lights. The first video clip played. It was Cam 7, the birdhouse cam. Clear as day, Bronson stood there, instructing Huey and Dewey. "I want that whole thing down. Make an example. These people think the rules don't apply to them. Show them they do." Gasps and angry mutters filled the room. Bronson sank lower in his chair, his face a mottled red. Clip after clip played. The chainsaws, the gleeful destruction, the casual arrogance, the close-up of Huey using a crowbar on a support beam, laughing. Then Dave, with a theatrical flourish, switched to a different feed, a split screen showing Bronson's statements at the cabin, juxtaposed with satellite imagery of recognized deer migratory corridors in the region, overlaid with expert testimony from a state biologist, a colleague I'd asked for a quick, informal opinion, debunking Bronson's claims about my specific location and lighting. The presentation was a masterclass in methodical dismantling. I laid out the legal case, the criminal complaints filed with the sheriff, the civil suit for damages, the formal complaint to the State Oversight Board detailing not just my incident but a pattern of abuse, citing specific bylaws Bronson had twisted or ignored. I then opened the floor. One by one, emboldened neighbors stood up. Mrs. Place Henderson, an elderly widow, recounted how Bronson had threatened her with fines for her bird feeders, claiming they attracted undesirable rodents, despite them being specifically designed to be squirrel-proof. Mr. Ramirez detailed how the HOA had put a lien on his house over the color of his trash cans, a color that wasn't even specified in the bylaws until after he'd bought them. The stories poured out, a dam of resentment finally breaking. The silent majority had found its voice. Bronson tried to interject, to defend himself, but his words were drowned out by the sheer volume of grievances. His power, built on intimidation and bluff, was evaporating under the harsh lights of public scrutiny and hard evidence. The climax came when Sarah Holloway, my AUSA contact, who had coincidentally decided to attend as an interested citizen, at my subtle invitation, stood up. She didn't introduce herself by title, just as a homeowner in a nearby county familiar with HOA law. She calmly, devastatingly, explained the personal liability Bronson and the board members could face for exceeding their authority and mismanaging HOA funds if the insurance refused to cover damages stemming from illegal acts. The words gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty hung in the air like a death sentence for their little regime. The reckoning was brutal, public, and surgically precise. The aftermath of that HOA meeting was like watching a poorly constructed dam burst. Bronson, stripped of his perceived authority and facing a barrage of legal and financial woes, resigned as president within days, citing health reasons. The irony was not lost on anyone. Several other board members, realizing the depth of their liability, followed suit. The Mountains Whisper Estates HOA was in disarray, its leadership decapitated, its reputation in tatters. My civil suit for the destruction of the deck moved forward with an almost apologetic swiftness from the HOA's insurer, who clearly wanted to limit their exposure. They settled for the full assessed value, plus a handsome sum for emotional distress and punitive damages, enough to rebuild the deck twice over, and then some. The check arrived via courier, accompanied by a letter of profound apology from the acting HOA board, now composed of shell-shocked residents scrambling to pick up the pieces. Sheriff Henderson, true to his word, pursued the criminal complaints. While the charges against Huey and Dewey were eventually reduced to misdemeanors, they flipped on Bronson almost immediately, eager to save their own skins. Bronson himself faced felony charges for conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and potentially more, depending on how the DA wanted to play it. His legal battles were just beginning, a slow, grinding process that would bleed him dry financially and emotionally. He had sought to make an example of me. Instead, he became the cautionary tale. The state agency overseeing HOAs launched a full investigation into Mountains Whisper, spurred by my complaint and the sudden flood of corroborating testimony from other homeowners. Bylaws were scrutinized, financials audited. The era of Bronson's tyranny was well and truly over. The neighbors, once cowed, were now energized. They formed committees, discussed reforms, and vowed to create an HOA that actually served the community, not the ego of one man. I stayed out of it, mostly. My war was won. Ranger Dave, however, became an unlikely folk hero. His technical assistance during the great HOA takedown of 23, becoming local legend. He even started a neighborhood watch program, complete with updated trail cam recommendations. The rebuilding of the deck became a symbolic act. I hired a local craftsman, a man whose grandfather had known mine. He used locally sourced sustainable timber, and we designed it to be even more integrated with the landscape, stronger, more beautiful. And yes, I reinstalled deck lighting. 2 amber, downward-facing, fully shielded LEDs, meticulously compliant with every conceivable standard, wildlife-friendly to a fault. They cast a warm, gentle glow on the new stairs, a quiet beacon of resilience. Every time I switched them on, it was a small, satisfying click of victory, a reminder that some lines should never be crossed. The psychological closure came not when the settlement check cleared, nor when Bronson was frog-marched out of a preliminary hearing, but when I finally sat on the newly finished deck with my daughter, pointing out constellations in the vast, dark sky, the only sounds the whisper of the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl, the sanctuary was restored. The peace, hard-won, settled back over the cabin. The forest, which Bronson had so arrogantly claimed to protect, remained indifferent to human squabbles, its ancient rhythms undisturbed. But for the humans within its periphery, a lesson had been learned. That authority, true authority, isn't about laminated cards and bluster. It's about knowledge, responsibility, and the unwavering will to protect what is right. And sometimes, it's about knowing that 17 trail cameras are always watching. The scent of fresh-cut cedar from the new deck mingled with the crisp autumn air. It was a good scent, a scent of renewal, of order restored. The legal battles had faded into paperwork, the drama into a cautionary anecdote swapped among neighbors. Bronson, I heard, had sold his house at a loss and moved several states away, his name now a byword for petty tyranny in Mountain's Whisper. The HOA, under new saner management, had even issued a public apology and initiated a fund to help repair some of the smaller damages Bronson's reign had inflicted on other properties. It was a start. My family reclaimed the cabin with a quiet joy. My daughter, who had been heartbroken by the sight of the destroyed deck, now sketched pictures of wildlife from its sturdy new railings, the incident already receding into the adventurous lore of childhood. For her, it was a story with a clear villain and a triumphant hero. For me, it was more complex, a somber reminder of the effort required to push back against the encroaching darkness of petty malice and unchecked ego. The legally lethal part of my persona, the one I usually reserve for those who preyed on the defenseless creatures of the wild, had been forced into the open to defend my own den. It was a tool I used sparingly, for its deployment always came with a cost, a certain weariness that settled deep in the bones. The cold-blooded calm, with explosive emotional undercurrents, was an accurate assessment of the state I'd inhabited. The calm was the training, the discipline. The undercurrent was the fierce, protective loyalty to my family, to the memory of my grandfather, to the sanctity of that small piece of earth. That loyalty was the fuel, the unyielding core that drove the tactical response. The supporting cast had played their roles perfectly. Ranger Dave, my eccentric, tech-savvy sidekick, was still dining out on the story, occasionally sending me links to new surveillance gadgets with notes like, "For your next HOA skirmish, boss?" Sarah Holloway, the OZA, had used the case as an example in a training seminar on jurisdictional cooperation, a testament to the surgical precision of our combined efforts. The neighbors, the silent majority turned rebellion fodder, were now actively engaged, their shared experience forging a stronger community bond than any number of forced potlucks ever could. The visual metaphors had all played out. The property line, the fence, had been breached and then emphatically reinforced. The porch light, the catalyst for the conflict, now burned brighter, a symbol of control regained. The locked gate of the cabin driveway now closed with a satisfying thud, a nightly ritual of psychological closure. And the blood? It was the sawdust of the old deck, the career implosion of a bully, the moral cost of inaction averted. The experience had reaffirmed a bleak truth, that vigilance is the price of peace, even in the quiet corners of the world. Men like Bronson, drunk on trivial authority, would always exist, always seek to expand their petty empires. The only defense was an unflinching commitment to one's own boundaries, backed by the knowledge and the will to enforce them. My federal clearance, my understanding of the law, my access to resources, these were privileges, yes, but also responsibilities. They were the hidden weapons that turned a potential victim into a reluctant warrior. The surprise reversal, the "they didn't know I was" hook, had been the linchpin of the entire affair. It was the asymmetry of information, the underestimation of an opponent, that led to Bronson's downfall. He saw a cabin owner. He failed to see the federal officer with the training and the network to dismantle his world. As the seasons turned, the cabin remained my sanctuary. The trail cameras, though now mostly capturing the quiet drama of deer, raccoons, and the occasional curious bear, were still there. A silent testament. A reminder. They said my deck lighting was a threat. They brought chainsaws and arrogance. They didn't know. They learned. And in the mountains' whisper estates, the deer continued their ancient migrations, utterly untroubled by appropriately shielded low-wattage amber LEDs. The natural order, in its own quiet way, had indeed been served.